Okay, hey everybody. It's great to be here with you, and thank you so much to Anmei and Mehan and to Mozilla for making this opportunity. And I also wanted to say I'm really happy to be here with everybody on Earth Day, and sorry that we're not marching, but I think we are here for science. I think we can agree on that. I don't know. If you don't, it's okay. We can also be here for people. So it's sort of the same thing in some ways, but I just wanted to first introduce the folks on the panel, and then also some of the facilitators that are in the room. My name is Greta Byrum, and I'm the director of a program called Resilient Communities, which is part of the Policy Institute New America. And I'm here with a couple of folks from my team over there, Human Saberi and Teresa Basilio, and also a couple of our partners on a big community wireless project we're working on in New York City. Yavmil Laura's back here, and Clayton Banks, who are also part of our larger New York City wireless project. We are building 6 community wireless networks in Sandy-impacted communities of New York City. More on that coming up. On the panel to my left is Maya Wiley. Maya is a nationally renowned expert on racial justice and equity. She has litigated, lobbied the U.S. Congress, and developed programs to transform structural racism in the U.S. and South Africa. Ms. Wiley is currently the Senior Vice President for Social Justice at the New School and the Henry Cohen Professor of Urban Policy and Management at the New School's Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. And she's the chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, which is the independent oversight agency for the city's police department.
Which means I'm tired.
She also is the mother of 2 teenagers. Yeah, 2.
Okay, I'm exhausted.
Dabriah Alston, sitting next to Maya. Dabriah is a visionary and an author, and she uses the power of words to inspire change. She is a speaker and is also the project manager of Red Hook Wi-Fi, which we'll talk about a little bit today. And Dabriah is working to cultivate connection through the expansion of the community's existing mesh network, and that's Red Hook Brooklyn. And she says she's excited to take part in the creation of a community-led, resilient network that will provide employment opportunities for Red Hook residents. And on the end is Lindsay-Paige McCloy, who is here representing the Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation. And she works with government entities, academic institutions, industry partners, and New York City residents to develop new solutions to pressing city problems. Lindsay-Paige comes most recently from research and development at the New York State Power Authority. And she's worked in research and innovation in energy, global health, product development, and public broadcasting. And I also wanted to just have our facilitators for the day stand up. So Laura Watkins, are you here? She's in the hall. She leads platform evangelism for eBay New York City. So hopefully when she comes back in, we can all look at her and make her feel a little awkward. No, just kidding. Scott Turnbull. And Scott is the National Technology Leader for US Ignite, which is a National Science Foundation program, right? And then over here is Josh King. And so note these folks. Josh King, I'm going to actually introduce in a minute to tell a little bit more of the story of what happened in New York City right around Sandy. But he is, freelance software developer focused on social justice causes, among many other things. So I wanted to just start out today by thinking for a little minute about Sandy, which we're going to come up on the 5-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy this fall. And Sandy was really a watershed moment in understanding the need for resilience solutions in New York City. And really this challenge is coming at the right moment, just as we're sort of coming to the learnings from Sandy that are really going to inform how we plan for the future. And this is happening at a moment when they've just updated the flood maps for New York City, and where we, in 2016, the updated flood maps from, these are the FEMA and New York City flood maps, they double the number of New York City residents living in flood zones. By some projections, a quarter of the city will be subject to flooding by 2050, a quarter of the city. And so what happened in Sandy was that we learned what it looks like when a catastrophic storm comes to a city like New York. And what happened was 233 people died, $75 billion worth of damage, and we learned about vulnerabilities in our infrastructure. We learned about where and how communication failed. And we also learned about some of the social costs in terms of sort of spatial inequities, about who was really exposed to damage and who which communities bore the most damage and harm from the storm. And what we learned is that people in public housing, people in neighborhoods that were already challenged with economic problems, underemployment, other issues, these were the communities that were hit the hardest. And in many of these cases, people were isolated, elders living on upper floors of public housing buildings were without heat or food. And it was really a challenge to get volunteers and get folks out to find the people that were the hardest hit in Sandy. And so since then, New York City has had an opportunity to begin to address some of the problems that became evident. And that's happening in multiple ways, obviously. There's infrastructure being built that will try to keep storm surges out of lower Manhattan. There's all kinds of initiatives that the mayor's office and others are rolling out. But we're also really trying to learn how to build social infrastructure and how to address the needs of communities to find, identify, and help the most vulnerable folks. And so I just wanted to quickly tell the story of our little world, some of the folks in this room, what happened before and after Sandy, which was that some of us had been working for a while, and I want to point to Josh King, who built a platform, a mesh platform, back starting in about 2008, something like that. 2009, yeah. So this mesh platform was called Commotion. And we were working at the time in DC, and we had this hunch that this would be a tool that could potentially be really important in an emergency. And around the same time, Tony Schloss at the Red Hook Initiative had gotten in touch with us and said, I really want to have an online, a community radio station at Red Hook. And we said, okay, well, we have an idea. What if we have internet radio, and what if we help you guys build a mesh network that the internet radio can run on? And so we started doing that together with this was the Open Technology Institute together with the Red Hook Initiative. And we always had this hunch, like we had this idea in the back of our head that at some point this might be something that was important in a hurricane or a flood. But it wasn't until Sandy actually hit that it became evident exactly how it was going to be useful. And so what happened was Sandy hit, communications went down in Red Hook along with a lot of other parts of the city. However, this little scrappy mesh network running Commotion in Red Hook kept working. And there's a lot of reasons it kept working. It was something that people could troubleshoot on the spot. It was pretty, low cost to maintain. There were folks in Red Hook that could, run around and fix routers and make sure that they were working. And essentially, the Red Hook Initiative was able to use this network to reach the folks I was talking about, the people in public housing that were isolated and cold, and there were no elevators. So the Red Hook Initiative was able to send volunteers out to these places. So that became a really like a watershed moment in understanding the importance of something like a kind of community-run and managed wireless network. And now, so based on that knowledge, that's why we've expanded out to 6 additional communities in New York City. Red Hook Initiative is up and running, and they basically do it their own way now, which is awesome. And so now our additional 6 communities are working with Red Hook Initiative as partners in a larger sort of push to make us more resilient, not only technologically, but also sort of socially, to anticipate the kinds of things that would happen in an emergency. So I just want to just highlight that story in terms of understanding where we are, that the flood zones are growing. More and more New Yorkers are going to be living in flood zones, and we're going to need to be not only technically but socially prepared to identify and help those that are most vulnerable. There are a lot of overlapping challenges in these communities. It's not just storm preparedness that's an issue. Communities that are in the flood zones also often have high unemployment rates, other economic challenges, and there are a lot of environmental justice communities, by which I mean communities that, where there are brownfields or other hazards that they have to manage alongside of storm preparedness and, issues with some of the economy and other challenges. So, given all of that, we have a lot to do in the next couple of years before the next hurricane hits, which it's going to do at some point. And I just want to turn to our panelists to start to talk about how the opportunity that Mozilla is putting out here today and the NSF can begin to address some of the things that are looming on the horizon, most likely. So I first want to just open by asking you all a question, and we can just go down the line. And that is, what do you think is the biggest challenge to access, inclusion, and safety in New York City right now? And that could be either in terms of storms and climate impact, or just in general.
Good morning. That's a big question. Let me say there's a couple of things I just want to add by way of background on New York that maybe many of you already know, but a lot of people are often surprised by, which is 1 in 5 New Yorkers do not have broadband at home. 1 in 5. We are the second largest tech sector in the country, and 20% of our residents do not have home broadband. The second thing to note about that, as Greta was talking, is that if you look at poverty, it's 36%. So 36% of our poor residents do not have broadband at home, and the large majority of that are Black, Latino, and Asian, all right? Not exclusively, but the vast majority. So when we talk about vulnerable populations, I think it's also important for us to be explicit about who is vulnerable and the fact that we have a lot of racialized inequities when we're talking about who is vulnerable. And the other thing I just add in terms of the Sandy impacted communities is 66% of our vulnerable population lived within a half mile of a flood zone, and almost 30% lived in the flood zone during Hurricane Sandy. So we should just name that vulnerability. It's race, it's poverty, and it's disproportionate in terms of environmental vulnerability, as well as lack of infrastructure, unemployment, felony records that also keep people out of jobs. So I think our biggest challenge is the fact that we so often normalize what we think of vulnerability without understanding that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. If you're an undocumented and Latino, your vulnerabilities are simply not the same as if you are say a Muslim documented citizen, both of whom have extreme vulnerabilities, or if you are a Black man with a felony record. They all have extreme vulnerability, but they're not identical vulnerabilities. So we also have to think about, when we think about what kinds of access we're trying to help people have and what it produces for them, It's how do we think about that access and that resiliency in context with how communities are vulnerable and how the technology enables at least, and at minimum, a triple bottom line solution, which is power, which is innovation, and jobs, not simply the technology itself, because the technology is a vehicle, it's not the road.
Thank you. Yes. One of the things I think of when I think of challenges in this Wi-Fi network arena is affordability. And I speak to that from the lens of someone who grew up in public housing, right? So who is technically, by society's standards, I grew up in poverty, you know, impoverished or whatever you want to call it, even though I did not feel that way. And I'll give you an example of two different households, right? So when we talk about affordability, I've grown up in a household in public housing where, you know, my mom has always been on the forefront of technology. So when computers, you know, became popular, we had a computer. When the internet, you know, came out and that became like this normal utility, we had internet. But then when I start looking to other people around me, that's not the case. So my godson grew up, his godmother is, his mother is my godsister, and they live in the next building. And they didn't have access to these things, so it took them a very long time to get a computer. They didn't have access, they couldn't afford it. It took them a very long time to get, you know, the internet. At first he was going to the library to complete his homework and do his schoolwork and things like that, and it's such an inconvenience. But for $70 a month, my godsister has to choose if she's going to put that money towards internet or if she's going to buy food. Which do you think is going to win? You know, so I was in a position where we didn't have to make those choices. We had food and we had this technology. Some people don't have that option. Like, they have to choose that thing that's going to feed them and fill them and keep them alive. So for me, the biggest challenge, well, one of the biggest challenges I see is just the affordability. People being able to afford this very powerful tool that is really taking us into the future that people are going to need.
So I would agree heartily with everything everyone to my right has said. And then, you know, from the lens of someone who's working in more of a municipal aspect at the moment, you know, so we do a lot of work in Brownsville, which is a neighborhood in East Brooklyn, which is about 87,000 people, 1 in 2 who do not have internet access at home, mostly for reasons of affordability, and then, you know, the power dynamics that Maya touched upon, but also because of a variety of infrastructural limitations, both real and imagined, that sort of have come to be at this point, you know, thanks to our nice franchise and corporate partners in the internet access game. So I think a real opportunity to address some of these challenges with some of these community approaches is to leapfrog some of those institutional barriers. So it costs a lot of money to lay fiber in New York City. It takes time. There's not conduit. You know, I can talk for days about what conduit looks like now in parts of New York City, which is a disaster. So I think when we start thinking about like the physical challenges that might be the more traditional infrastructural challenges, we just have to think really creatively about ways to go around the system that we've all presumed is the way we have to do it.
Great, thanks guys. So I guess like diving right into that, what are some ways that you guys think that this opportunity that Mozilla and the National Science Foundation is opening up, how could these challenges address the challenges, by which I mean the Mozilla competition, which we're calling a challenge, how could it address some of the things that you guys just raised?
So, you know, in all challenge, there's opportunity. And some of the things that, what we didn't say is in my previous life, I was counsel to the mayor charged with universal broadband access before going to the new school. And so one of the opportunities is that the city has actually created a fund that it is using to give free home broadband access to 21,000 public housing residents in 7 developments in every borough of the city. So one of the opportunities there, and the reason, by the way, that we took that strategy, one was affordability. We couldn't afford to give free service universally across the whole city, and secondly, we didn't need to, particularly if we held our franchisees more accountable. So there's a notice of default to Verizon, one of my parting gifts. But one of the things that is really important to note then is, if that is a very unique opportunity, and we're a very unique city because no other city that we know of has a capital fund for broadband access, and deploying it by creating truly public, in the sense that the city's putting in the CapEx and building the wireless network. But what does that mean? Like, what can we build off that? And how do we think about, so that's a real opportunity to think about these hyper-local, what I'll call hyper-local, even though they reach thousands and thousands of people, but these hyper-local infrastructure strategies that leapfrog over some of our existing infrastructural challenges, and are deeply focused on highly excluded populations of people. And I think the opportunity in that is not just to think about how we build off of that and leverage it, but how do we do it in a way that is actually creating jobs for those residents. The unemployment rates in public housing, particularly for young adults, is like 60%. Some of them with criminal records. So there's a real opportunity to think about how these are actually also job creators, not just thinking of residents as passive users or consumers of technology, but actually actively engaged in economic innovation because of technology.
One of the things that really stands out for me is this creation of jobs. And not just jobs, right, but pathways to careers, to real careers that can provide long-term sustainability for people. And I remember when I first got into the role of project manager of Red Hook Wi-Fi, and I'm just researching and looking at different things and thinking about it in relation to this place I've called home for so long. And I feel like anytime we're met with a challenge, right, especially one that's so close to home, we need to look at those things around us that can be the most powerful, the most helpful in changing and bringing about, systemic, like real deep change. So I like to look in my direct field of influence, right? And that's one of the things I've been able to do recently, where I would always look so broadly at things. I'm starting to kind of pull my focus into right where I am, right? So when I look at the challenges that are in my community, one of them is, as you said, these barriers to employment for particular people. So I live in a neighborhood where we do have a lot of people that are felons, so that creates a barrier. Sometimes these people, these people that I live amongst, my brothers and sisters, my neighbors, don't carry themselves in ways that lend to being seen as professional, right? You use a vernacular. You speak a certain way, and you're not professional enough to hold a job. You dress a certain way, so you can't work here. So there are all these barriers to these people who are just normal people who just happen to have grown up in a certain culture, right? To them getting opportunities for work. So what I loved about Red Hook Wi-Fi, and just the opportunity that monies like this provide for these networks, is that they provide these opportunities to move past these barriers. So we have this group called young adults called digital stewards that we kind of bring in and train, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with that term. We train them on how to maintain a network, how to do video production, just all of these technical things that they can learn and kind of take into a career and to, market themselves in terms of getting jobs. But also, it's not just the technical training. Now there's, how do you act in a workplace? What are your bosses going to expect of you? What your company, your organization is going to expect of you? So it just puts all of these tools in place that normally would not be there if not for these technologies.
I have a question for you, Lindsay-Paige, but I first wanted to just uplift a couple of things that Dabriah said. So digital stewardship as an approach is something we're doing in all of our 6 partner communities, as well as what's happening in Red Hook. There are also some digital stewards programs in other parts of the country, but I wanted to just point that out as one of the ways that New York City's approach to this is unique, and that is in really trying to root these technologies and the ownership and the management of these technologies in communities. And that really is an approach that's designed to address some of the critiques around, sort of parachute civic tech that kind of comes in and drops a solution on a community and then leaves. And so we really want to see what emerges from these challenges in every project like this as something that the community can take on, can manage, that's sustainable for the community. The other thing I wanted to uplift from what Maya was saying was that New York City's approach to broadband build-out is also unique in that I've heard her refer to it as a network of networks many times, that the vision, that New York City didn't sort of decide to take sort of a top-down master planning approach to broadband, but instead sort of built on the, underlying structure of the internet, which is distributed, in order to think about a policy and build-out approach. And so that's really a unique opportunity, because what we see is that community initiatives, like the ones we're talking about here, are able to kind of mesh with, no pun intended, other things that are happening on behalf of the city and other groups. But Lindsay-Paige, just to wrap up our part of the panel, can you talk about a couple of things, specific things that New York City's doing, or other initiatives that are happening in New York City, maybe not just what the mayor's office is doing?
Yeah, sure. So I work a little bit more on sort of like the new technology side. So doing a lot of work on technology proofs of concept, working with communities to identify needs that we can then use technology as one of many tools to try to address. But we're seeing a lot of really exciting stuff in sort of like the network technology space in general here. So one of the, we've got a few people in the room, I think, from like GoTenna and a couple of other small startups here in New York City who are doing really cool work, both, in terms of thinking about how we can provide connectivity to folks both on and off the grid in a variety of different ways that are not just kind of like your traditional Wi-Fi sort of approach. So thinking about how we take technologists who are already doing this kind of like human-centered, community-driven work and connect them with communities like Red Hook, using that model. We're like shamelessly ripping off everything that everybody here on the panel has done to really plug into additional communities and kind of like build those pathways to careers, and also make sure that we're fitting technologies to solutions. There's also things that are happening, in like the distributed power generation space that I think are an interesting parallel. So as we think more and more about New York City as a collection of neighborhoods with different needs, and thinking about how the resources can be generated more in those communities, the power that comes from having those resources stays in the community, and then how we think about all those things together. So when we think about a mesh network, how are we also thinking about how that relates to like an off-grid cogeneration plant, for instance, or a waste-to-energy facility, or a compost facility, or like a cooperative to support small businesses. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on kind of in that newer technology space. So we're really excited about the potential of this funding to kind of help get over that initial barrier to proof of concept for folks, because we are talking in the proof of concept phase. This isn't going to necessarily ensure that a community wireless network is going to be self-sustaining for 10 years, but it will help kind of like bridge that gap in terms of like the capital funding or the initial assets. So it's cool stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm a believer in naming the tension because I think tension's a healthy thing, and I think it's how we innovate and become more effective by leaning into it. And so the one thing I just think we should name is all these things, and I really, really appreciate what the Mayor's Office of Technology Innovation is doing, because I think it is really important and creative. And one of the opportunities it gives us is to think about how we actually do the community engagement. Because I think so often what I have seen, and I'm not a technologist, right? I'm a racial justice advocate that just knows we need this, is there needs to be translation between technologists who are highly knowledgeable and skilled and incredibly committed and dedicated with the conversations around community needs. And so Dabriah and I were having this conversation about how even with the wireless corridors that the city was creating, residents are like, but I got mold in my apartment. And so you're now telling me I'm gonna have free broadband with a lot of mold? So, you know, that's real. And I think the answer isn't to say, you're right, you shouldn't have broadband, but there has to be some way to, right? That's not the answer. But there has to be some way to actually have a translation between what technology can do so that residents are more able to participate in it as equal partners. And we often skip that step because we typically don't get enough support for that interstitial tissue of connecting the technology to the community. So one really interesting thing to think about is how in the partnerships around this challenge can that be built into the concept?
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Maya. Yeah, so I think basically, you know, what we see in New York is a very kind of fertile space where there's a lot going on and where there's also a lot to consider in terms of some of the overlapping challenges in the most vulnerable parts of the city. And, you know, I think also it's just a really interesting moment for this 5 years after Sandy when a lot of the Sandy recovery money is drying up right now. It's coming to an end. So there's, you know, the need to continue to be prepared, and yet that funding has gone away, and yet the need is more apparent than ever. So this is a really interesting moment and a really interesting place for this work to happen. And given that, I want to open up the floor to some questions. And do we have to pass around a mic, or can people kind of shout it out?
It would be good for the workshop to mark out.
Okay. Clayton Banks.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I was going to introduce myself, but thanks, Greta.
Yeah.
So I just had a quick question. Maybe Maya and Lindsay can sort of deal with this question, which is, should cities really be the ISP? Or this challenge, which will have a bunch of people who might want to be ISPs or whatever, provide service into the city? What's more efficient? I'm curious. There's been rumors of the city trying to run basically become an ISP in some ways. But then there's some existing things like Red Hook, et cetera, that are going on, and new resilient ones that are going on, and a bunch that will come out of this room that will be going on. So I'm just curious, what, in your experience or even your opinion, what's more efficient?
So I want to start with, I don't think it's a either or, and I think we can't think in mutually exclusive terms. We should think in both and terms. So I know of no desire on the part of the city to be an ISP, although I think it's a conversation the city should have, but not any more than we should have only one or two ISPs serving a neighborhood. What we really need are multiple solutions, multiple actors, public and private. So in my view, it's a both and. But I would say on the issue of efficiency, I don't think that's the starting question. I think the issue is impact. So efficiency can only be measured in relationship to its larger social good. So sometimes what may in a narrow sense be called more efficient may produce less and therefore be less efficient. So I think we start by what are the impacts and then consider whether the benefits make the costs efficient.
So I'm a mechanical engineer, so in my ideal world, if we were starting from scratch, I would have designed this network system a lot differently in terms of efficiency. But we're kind of here now with the patchwork of things that we have. So the way that we tend to think about it is really trying to encourage interoperability at as many points as possible. And then also incentivizing kind of like common approaches and standards as well. So thinking about how maybe all of the new community networks have like a baseline agreement of a privacy and security policy. I know for the resilient community networks that, all the communities are developing their own privacy policies, which totally makes sense because, every community is going to have a different way to think about privacy and ownership, but as long as we're meeting like a set of certain common standards, and then thinking about interoperability as more of these networks pop up. So you can be on the Silicon Harlem network and then walk down to the Red Hook Initiative and still be connected and not have to create like a new sign-in or authenticate again. So from a technical perspective, just thinking about interoperability, and from kind of like a network perspective, thinking about what the common standards are that we all want to uphold, and in making sure that these networks are responsible and safe for people.
Hey, I want to take another question, but I also wanted to respond really quick with my non-facilitator hat on, which is, I think too much consolidation in any market is really problematic, and I would throw that question back out there. Do you guys want to see Facebook be the ISP for everybody, or AT&T, Time Warner, Leviathan? So I think, like, going back to the Mozilla Healthy Internet report, one of the things that we do want to think about is a diverse marketplace that is localized, as somebody was asking questions about localization early on, and that's something that everybody was getting at earlier, is that the way people interact with technology depends on who they are and what their, who their community is. And so we really want to see things emerge that fit their communities, and that means diversity. Okay,
Hey,
there you got the mic.
So as far as I understand, the NSF Wins is like a global, event, and has a global lens to it. But today, a lot of what you've been discussing is about uniquely NYC and uniquely local solutions. So is that like advice to say, hey, there's a lot of opportunity here, and you should do real applied research, or are you like looking for New York City solutions or
So thank you
global
for your
ones?
question.
Yeah.
Nearly this many sirens in Harlem.
It's the scientists. The scientists are making trouble. The people marching for that. That's my guess. Anyway, so that question I'm going to kick over to Mozilla, because we on the panel are here to talk about our experience in New York City and to give you guys a sort of overview of what's happening here. So I can't speak to the challenge in general.
So it's a great question, so thank you very much. So this is a national challenge. So we're appealing. Okay, better? So it's a national challenge. So we're appealing to everyone across the nation. But, much of what I do is to fund sort of university technologists who have great ideas, but they're different from the ideas that typically come from the folks who are in this room, who might be providing more of a community perspective. Well,
Move away from the speaker.
good. Thank you. So again, national challenge. We're really looking, across the nation in all corners. So this is, we're hearing from folks in communities who I normally don't hear from at NSF. So this is fabulous. So I think that the great solutions that we'll see are not necessarily those that will come deep from, university researchers who are already looking at these problems, have been looking at these problems for decades, but will come from folks with a particular perspective. So to the extent that you could apply your particular perspective to this challenge, I think we'll get great solutions.
Great. So do we have time for, I know you've been wanting to ask a question. Okay, great.
Bob Gezelter, I'll throw in an observation because there's a sort of schism popping up under the water here. I had the dubious advantage of having gone to New Orleans to speak right the week or so after Katrina, actually a couple of weeks after Katrina, and I was here for Sandy. The problem that is not resolved by a mesh or anything else is logistics. The really weird crap, I'm censoring my language a little bit, happens in a disaster 48 to 96 hours after the impact, when the local caches of supplies run dry. In New York, we had 22 some odd offloading terminals for liquid petroleum products, none of which were operational after Sandy came through. The ones which had blown pumps and damaged piers had electricity. The ones which had intact facilities had no power. Therefore, people were lined up for half a mile with 5-gallon jerry cans trying to get gas for their generators, the ones that had generators. Cell towers went down because the batteries were only good for 24 to 48 hours. The standard issue FiOS battery is good for 24 hours.
Sir, do you have a question, or are you?
Well, it's an observation. Any solution has to really look at those logistics, because the underpinnings, it's great to have a nice mesh network in an area like Red Hook. If there's no power, the routers are hunks of sand.
So thank you so much. It's a great point that we really do have to design and keep all of these complexities in mind. I do want to just say that Red Hook is working on a solar solution right now. There are additional 6 communities, which I just want to name them because I've brought them up, but that's Hunts Point in the South Bronx, Gowanus, Sheep's Head Bay in Brooklyn, Midland Beach in Staten Island, Far Rockaway, and I always... East Harlem. Sorry, Clayton. You're sitting right in front of me. Clayton is our East Harlem partner. So in all of these communities, what we're doing is we're building backup battery power that will run for at least 2 days, which, given we can also recharge those battery packs. So we are thinking about that, but it's a great point to design.
My point for raising it is it's the point I didn't hear anybody mention, and it has to be first and foremost if anybody plans to use this capability in an emergency.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of stuff we didn't mention, actually.
Because the problem is everybody's
designing for security, et cetera, et cetera.
That's another area I play with, but the point of logistics, with everybody switching to cells, when the cell towers go down, having a solar power charger doesn't do you any good.
Sure. Okay, so I think right next to you there's a...
That you're thinking through the challenges, right? The panel clearly can't answer that right now, or we wouldn't have a challenge.
I've got just a specific question, but a little bit of background. So I'm leading a technology company which is looking at providing, through laser communication, high-speed 10 gigabit per second type communication. So the mesh network, I'm from New Mexico, and is anyone here from Mississippi? Or have family or friends? Well, we're just that much above Mississippi in terms of economic development. So the question is, have you seen, with the mesh network's localization on the economic development job creation side, is there data here in New York showing how effective that has been?
We're trying to create some right now.
I think the short answer is that there's some anecdotal data. Since Red Hook Initiative has digital stewards, obviously out of that program has data. We at the New School, a couple of my students are here from our Digital Equity Lab, are actually looking at models to expand on the digital stewards, not just the digital stewards model, but what that suggests and tells us about other things we need to do to really create that employment ladder for folks. And I think to your point also about, I just want to make this comparison to Mississippi, because actually Clayton's partner, Bruce Lincoln, and I, back when stimulus, the first stimulus packages, grant applications were thrown out there, tried to get money for a Mississippi Delta and South Bronx strategy on both not just having a wireless network that solved the last mile problem, rural and urban, but that did that in a way that thought about jobs. and didn't get that grant funded. And so I think part of what I would say back is that's exactly the right kind of question, and I think also to your point about new technologies like laser technology, but that I think is the exciting opportunity. The challenge is how do we embed that and look at that and examine it. And just to make the comment about logistics, which is so important, I did a lot of work on equitable rebuilding post-Sandy, but I just want to note the importance of this even in the absence of full answers to that question, because what happened in after Hurricane Katrina, it's not just that folks didn't have, as a city, didn't have those kinds of logistics. It's that even the volunteerism, like the Red Cross, actually had no social network connection to Black community in New Orleans, and they therefore weren't even getting served by the humanitarian aid. So if you think about the social capital that we create when we create these kind of networks, I mean, Red Hook Initiative it wasn't just the fact that it had the tower and it had the mesh network. It's that it was deeply embedded in community building, and the community building connections had been made, which meant those of us outside of Red Hook who were trying to figure out how to support Red Hook had a way to be in relationship with Red Hook. So even when we haven't solved all those problems, which are critically important to solve, there's also a way in which these networks create social capital, and I think that speaks to the opportunity.
So do we have time
we have time for one more, yeah.
Okay. Somebody else have a burning question? Over here.
So I appreciate you about sort of the need for communities and IT professionals to work together effectively and communicate well. Could you talk a little bit, if you ran into an IT professional who was doing that well from the community point of view, could you describe to me what would they do? Like, how would they communicate? What kind of questions would they ask? Anything, just what would that look like?
So I don't think I should answer it. I think actually Greta, who's done a lot, who was an example of this, but also Dabriah, because I think they're better, more grounded examples.
And Josh also, I think as a technologist who's worked with communities, can also speak to this. And so I just want to remind you all that there are like a lot of experts in this room, so that you can talk to folks throughout the day about how to do this. So, Clayton has been is a technologist and media maker who's been working closely with community in East Harlem. Jamil Laura back there, he's from the South Bronx, and he's teaching people how to be digital stewards. And so a lot of what I think is super important to keep in mind is that there is already stuff happening on the ground. I mean, there's a lot of folks already working on these issues. The Environmental Justice Alliance of New York City, We Act, Ready Red Hook, Lower East Side Ready. These are all organizations that are already they've already defined community needs. They already have the relationships in the community. So when we come in into a community, what we first try to do is listen and understand what's happening and who's doing what. And then we offer people help and support to whatever they're already doing. And so when the technologists come in, they're entering an existing framework, social framework, on the ground, and to the extent that we can, we try to support that framework. And so that means, not coming at people with like, I have a solution for you, but rather coming at people and saying, okay, what are you doing, and how can we support that with technology?
Thank you for asking that, because I don't think that people often consider, it's just kind of like, I want to help someone, and this is the help I think that is best for them. And I think sometimes we forget that these people usually know what helps they need, what supports they need. And I feel like when you're in a place where you've recovered or are in the recovery process from a storm, from some type of natural disaster or any type of disaster, you're in a place where people feel like it's okay to come and drop stuff on you. So different agencies will come and say, hey, we came up with this fabulous idea that'll help you the next time there's an emergency. Here. But what's not happening is these people are not coming to the community members and sitting down with them and saying, hey, we see what you went through. What do you think would be helpful for the next time you face a challenge like this? And there is no one-size-fits-all approach. You know, communities are very, very different. I see communities as families. And every family has a different way of being, of experiencing, of, you know, communicating with one another. So it's the same thing with communities. Red Hook is a very unique community, a very close-knit community, but also divided in the sense of, you know, the public housing and then the outskirts. So there are two, you know, distinct you know, modes or modalities of being, but there is like this cohesiveness as well. So, you know, it's really important to come in and just talk to people and find out what they want. So our digital stewards actually did a survey this summer to find out what people wanted to use Wi-Fi for. What did they need this for? Do they need it? You know, if they do, what are those things that are important? So we found things like people wanting to apply to job opportunities, you know, people wanting to do their homework, people wanting to get on YouTube. But just knowing that is so helpful. So thank you for even caring to ask.
I just want to add a layer because that I agree with everything that was said. The next layer after this is that technologists need to do some teaching. Because that's part of bridging the gap is to say, okay, now that I've listened and heard what you need, what you're working on, what knowledge is already here, what the framework is, let me help you understand where the technology is so that folks are better able then to work as partners to say, okay, then here's what we want the technology to do. And so one of the things that, I'll give you a very practical example of this. So my students encountered this in our digital equity lab on ID NYC, trying to understand how to create more protection in our new political environment for undocumented residents, right, who need this ID. And going to really, really thoughtful, considerate, committed technologists who then said, well, they just shouldn't get the card, right? Because there's too much vulnerability. Well, they need the card. There's so many things folks need. So it's helping understand, okay, well, let's talk about where and how there's vulnerability so that you can better help us think about how we can support your security in utilizing it. So there has to be some capacity bringing in terms of understanding that technology so that residents can then reflect and help do the next level.
Yeah, and so, you know, basically everything everyone has said, but so one of the projects that my team is working on right now is building a community technology advisory board and like a neighborhood innovation program in Brownsville. And one of the things that we learned pretty quickly was that a lot of these communities, especially that are impacted by, you know, multiple vectors, so it's like environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice, have been over-researched to like within like, they've told people what their problems are so many times and haven't actually seen tangible solutions. So it's like more than a post-it session when you're trying to figure out what the actual needs are in the community. So it does require sustained engagement. The flip of that, the slight gloom I will bring to this is also, you know, when you're working with people in the community and elevating what they're doing, being mindful also of like how many different people are starting to call those same people. So like my worst nightmare is a little bit coming true right now, which is, you know, I get a lot of calls from vendors of all types telling me that they have the next best thing for me from like the city perspective. Now those calls, because we've been saying like, well, you should really be responding to needs in communities, those are now going to people who are like really busy managing like criminal justice, like, you know, re-entry programs, and they're getting calls from like smart cities vendors telling them they need this smart light bulb. It's like, no, that's not gonna work either. So, you know, I don't have the answer to kind of like that in-between space. We're working on building something in Brownsville that maybe will help. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But yeah, just kind of, I think, making sure you're supporting at a time that is helpful for the community, and so that it's kind of like a two-way engagement. So you're doing that teaching, that support, but also they're kind of like, oh, so I see how this does impact me, and I'm going to work with you to make this happen. So.
One more question, or? Yep. Great. You're the last one. Where's the mic?
Here, I'm holding it.
Is this better? Yeah. My name is Sharda. I am a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, where we are leading a data gathering effort on connecting data, socioeconomic impact data of connectivity, internet connectivity. And I had a question specifically for Red Hook, because I heard earlier that there is some anecdotal data that's already been collected on stories of how this has helped create employment ladders. If there's any systematic survey that has already been done or is being planned to understand not just the impact on employment, but also on other things like education opportunities, healthcare outcomes, financial inclusion, access to digital financial services. These are the kind of things that, in general, I've been looking at, but more in a global lens and more in community networks across the world. I haven't really been able to see much of this kind of data in my understanding, and we're doing some of it right now. But I just wanted to know, given that there's already an existing effort, if there's been work that's done or work that's being planned.
So it's definitely not happening yet. Our network started off as this really small network, right? And it's been used primarily for what we were saying earlier, the Sandy recovery. And even moving forward, we have some residents and people just passing through who kind of get on, but we haven't done any research yet. But part of this expansion is really, to focus on those things and to pay attention to how it's being used and how we can offer even more support in those ways. So that is something we are planning on, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore that it's really difficult for a neighborhood organization that's already doing direct support for residents to then take on a wireless network, and then even harder for them to take on sort of impact demonstration to demonstrate the outcomes, and so it's really hard, and it also takes a long time. It's longitudinal, right? And it's very hard to figure out what the impact of the Wi-Fi is as opposed to other things happening in the community. But I will say that the longer story of Red Hook and digital stewardship actually comes out of the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program originally. So going back to the stimulus of 2009, that's how we first developed the idea and the curriculum for digital stewardship with the Detroit Community Technology Project in Detroit. And there's a lot of research that's come out of BTOP over the years that, it would be fascinating to really track all of the things that have emerged over time. And I'll also say that in our 6 new communities in New York City, we are launching a monitoring and evaluation effort alongside, but it's going to be quite difficult to manage that alongside of everything else. There's also a researcher at MIT. Her name is Aditi Mehta, and she worked with the Red Hook digital stewards to do this survey that they did, and I think that's going to be published, or is published, right? Okay, yeah, so I think it's out. There's a sort of the findings of that one participatory action research project. Okay, great. Well,
thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Don't move. Right. Thanks to the panel. So if you guys can just stay seated for 1 second. But thank you all very much. That was very rich. And I think it really sort of illustrates much of what we would like to see happen for the rest of the day, which is the opportunity for researchers and technologists and students and community members to actually come together and start having these conversations together rather than in silos. And obviously there's a lot going on, in New York and various parts of the country, but there's a reason why nothing's really worked yet. It's not like this is a problem people haven't been trying to solve since 9/11, right? And so I think, NSF, who has had years of thinking about this and thinking this through, the idea of actually pulling together teams of people who are working together towards these solutions and offering what's best of what you do to come up with solution is really one of the main emphasis behind getting to the ultimate goals that we all want to get to at the end. And that's the reason why it's set up this way, so that you have time between now and when the first stage in terms of the conceptual phase is submitted, and time between that and the prototype stage to design something too as well. And so it's the time to really listen to each other and really hear each other and gather data and gather information from not just one another in the room, but others too as well. And it's hard, you know, it's hard to talk across different fields, quite frankly, because sometimes you don't talk the same language, right? But you're actually talking about the same thing. And so the power of being able to pull together solutions like this, as these all folks know in the community, this is the opportunity to pull those things together. And I know, just based on the demographics we've looked at, in terms of who's here, there is a really nice mix of researchers, technologists, students, who are working in these various areas, and community members too as well. And so for the next half an hour or so, 45 minutes, we're going to do a little bit of speed dating with you all, so that you get a chance to get to know each other and have different kinds of conversations. And that's the goal behind the dots. So it wasn't, we're not. There's nothing like mysterious about the dots, except that the dot on your front, we want you all to actually go to different parts of the room here and be able to take the time to get to know each other, talk about who you are, what you represent, what you hope will happen, and the kinds of things that you can offer each other, and start to have some of those intro conversations. So we're going to do that. We'll do 2 rounds of that, and then we're also going to do a round of actually focused on the 2 challenges themselves. And don't forget, there's actually 2 challenges, right? And so one is about response after a disaster, and the other is about an even more pervasive infrastructure that occurs beyond that 48 hours when you have to speak. It's like, how do you use existing infrastructure to actually keep people committed? And I would also say, open your minds to different possibilities other than what you're working on here. Some examples that I've actually heard, from third world countries, quite frankly, is they're trying to get connected with none of the resources that we have in the US, right? And they're using things like 2G. So imagine, you could connect through 2G for 48 hours. You just need that, right? In terms of that. Other examples of opportunities that have actually been awarded through another challenge that we've done at Mozilla called Equal Ratings is using television waves, right? TV waves to connect communities and rural communities that haven't been able to necessarily connect before. So think broadly, but in some ways simply, we don't use those anymore, right? We're always going to the next level up. So, all right, so everyone's got their dots on the front, right? So let's see. Red group in the corner by the coffee. How about that? Green group over here. Yellow group up here by the panelists. And blue group back there in the corner. And we'll spend 10 minutes for you guys to say who you are, what you do, why this is important to you, and how you might be able to connect.